Before these words continue, pause for a moment and consider how far their echoes travel. As you listen, write in the comments which city you are listening from, and if these chronicles speak to you, subscribe so the forgotten past is not lost again. Now, let the oldest war of Toril be opened. In the first ages of the world, when Toril was still young and the heavens were closer to the earth, there were no nations, no written laws, and no mortal empires. The world belonged to powers that did not think in generations, but in eternities. Two such powers rose above all others: the dragons, ancient even by immortal standards, and the giants, children of divine order. Their conflict would become the first true apocalypse, long before mortals learned to name catastrophe. The giants believed the world had been given shape through purpose. Anum, the All-Father, greatest of their gods, had forged giant kind with hierarchy woven into their very souls. Each caste had a place. Each place had meaning. Storm giants ruled as visionaries and judges, cloud giants as nobles and schemers, fire giants as conquerors and builders, frost giants as raiders, stone giants as keepers of memory, and hill giants as the lowest, burdened by gluttony and simplicity. This was not merely culture, it was divine law. To the giants, Toril was meant to be ruled, measured, and shaped according to Anum's design. Dragons did not see design, they saw birthright. They were creatures of raw creation, born of the world's elemental fury. Fire, storm, acid, frost, and lightning ran in their blood. The eldest dragons remembered the shaping of mountains and the cooling of seas. To them, the sky was not a domain to be governed, but a throne already claimed. They did not acknowledge hierarchy beyond strength, and even strength was temporary. A dragon ruled because none could challenge it. When that changed, so did the rule. From the beginning, coexistence was fragile. Giants raised fortresses upon peaks that dragons had long claimed as eyries. Dragons hunted across valleys the giants sought to tame. What the giants called order, dragons saw as intrusion. What dragons claimed as ancient right, giants dismissed as chaos. Neither race could imagine yielding, because to yield would be to deny the truth of their own creation. The earliest clashes were not yet a war. A storm giant citadel shattered by dragonfire, a great worm driven from its lair by rune-carved weapons. Each side told itself these were isolated acts, necessary corrections rather than declarations. But memory does not fade among immortals. It accumulates. As centuries passed, grudges hardened into doctrine. Giants began to speak of dragons not as rivals, but as obstacles to the world Anum intended. Dragons, in turn, came to see giants as an infestation spreading across the high places of the world. This shift mattered. Once the conflict became ideological, compromise ceased to exist. The war began not with a single battle, but with escalation. Giants learned to forge weapons capable of piercing draconic scales, empowered by runic magic older than mortal spellcraft. Dragons responded with coordinated devastation, entire flights descending upon giant strongholds. The skies became killing grounds. Mountains cracked under sustained assault. Seas boiled where ancient worms fought storm giants who called down the wrath of the clouds themselves. This was not war as mortals would later understand it. There were no borders to defend, no civilians to spare. Every fortress was a weapon, every lair a target. The world itself became collateral. At the center of it all stood belief. The giants fought with certainty that divine order was on their side. Their hierarchies allowed them to marshal armies, plan campaigns, and rebuild after losses. There was comfort in structure, even in destruction. Dragons fought with equal certainty, but of a different kind. They believed no god had the authority to deny their dominion. Many of the eldest dragons had never bowed to divine will, and never would. This difference shaped everything that followed. By the time the conflict was openly recognized as a war, Toril had already changed. Lands were uninhabitable. Ancient magic had been drawn into the world in quantities never seen before. The balance between sky, stone, and sea had begun to fracture. The dragon-giant war had truly begun, and it would not end with victory alone. It would end with a world forever altered, and neither side yet understood the price they were about to pay. Once the war was fully awakened, it no longer moved like a storm, but like a season with no end. What had begun as clashes between powerful individuals hardened into a sustained annihilation of landscapes, resources, and memory itself. The giants understood this shift first, because they alone among the two possessed something resembling an empire. Across Toril, giant kind mobilized according to the will of Anum, the All-Father. Storm giants convened councils atop cloud-wreathed peaks, interpreting omens and divine signs. Fire giants expanded their forges until entire mountains glowed from within, shaping colossal weapons meant not merely to wound dragons, but to break them. Frost giants raided relentlessly, driving dragons from northern ranges through sheer attrition. Stone giants retreated deeper into the earth, preserving what knowledge they could, while hill giants were hurled forward in brute force assaults, expendable but numerous. This was hierarchy in motion, efficient, terrible. The dragons faced this structure with something they had rarely needed before: adaptation. They had never been a unified people. Each dragon ruled alone, trusted none, and answered to no banner. Yet the scale of destruction forced a change in behavior. Flights formed, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Ancient worms learned that even they could be overwhelmed by rune-armed giant hosts. This realization altered draconic warfare. Rather than meeting giant armies directly, dragons began to strike at what sustained them. Forges were targeted. Storm giant observatories were burned from the skies before their auguries could be completed. Supply routes that only giants could traverse were shattered, collapsing entire campaigns before they reached the battlefield. These were not acts of rage, but of calculation. Here, the war crossed a threshold. For the first time in Toril's history, magic was deployed not as isolated acts of power, but as a systemic weapon. Giant runes reshaped gravity, turned stone against flesh, and bound elemental forces into weapons of mass destruction. Dragons answered with ancient sorceries passed only among the eldest, spells that twisted weather patterns for decades and poisoned the land long after the fighting moved on. The consequences were immediate. Entire regions became unstable. Mountains collapsed under sustained magical stress. Volcanic chains erupted where fire giants and red dragons clashed without restraint. Storm systems grew permanent and hostile, no longer natural phenomena, but lingering scars of divine-scale conflict. Toril was no longer merely a battlefield. It was becoming a casualty. At the center of this escalation lay Anum himself. The giants believed his silence was approval. He did not halt the war. He did not withdraw his favor. To them, this meant the struggle was righteous, a necessary cleansing of chaos from the world. That belief hardened their resolve and justified every excess. The more devastating the war became, the more convinced they were that order demanded it. Dragons interpreted that same silence very differently. To many of the eldest worms, Anum's absence was proof that gods were distant things, incapable of enforcing their will against true power. If a god could not stop the destruction of the world he claimed to shape, then his authority was meaningless. This belief fed draconic arrogance, but it also bred contempt, not just for giants, but for divine order itself. By this stage of the war, victory was no longer defined by conquest. It was defined by endurance. Each side believed the other would eventually collapse under the weight of its own nature. Giants trusted that structure and divine purpose would outlast individualistic fury. Dragons trusted that rigid hierarchy would fracture when pushed beyond its limits. Both assumptions would prove partially correct and catastrophically incomplete. What became clear, even then, was that Toril could not survive indefinitely under such pressure. The war had outgrown its causes. It now fed upon its own momentum, reshaping the world faster than either dragons or giants could fully comprehend. And still, neither side would yield. As the war dragged across uncounted ages, patterns began to emerge that neither side had anticipated. The giants still possessed numbers, coordination, and the confidence of divine sanction, but their strength relied on something fragile: unity within Anum's ordained order. Dragons, watching from the skies and deep places of the world, began to understand this weakness with increasing clarity. The ordning bound giant kind together, but it also constrained them. Storm giants were expected to lead, to divine the future and command with wisdom rather than immediacy. Fire giants could not act without purpose sanctioned by higher caste authority. Frost giants were feared, but rarely trusted. Hill giants were used and discarded. Each role was fixed, ancient, and resistant to change. In a world at peace, this hierarchy created stability. In a war of annihilation, it slowed response and punished deviation. Dragons learned to strike where hierarchy mattered most. Rather than assaulting giant hosts head-on, they began targeting storm giant enclaves and oracle sites, places where decisions were made, not where armies gathered. The loss of a single storm giant did not merely weaken a force, it disrupted prophecy, planning, and morale. When visions failed or leaders vanished in flame and thunder, entire campaigns stalled. This was not coincidence. It was strategy. Among the dragons, the eldest worms began to share knowledge, if not loyalty. They did not gather in councils as giants did, but they observed, learned, and remembered. Ancient blues charted giant movements across deserts and high plateaus. Reds memorized forge cycles and seasonal campaigns. Whites harried supply lines through relentless attrition. Even rival dragons tolerated one another's presence when their goals aligned. This cooperation was temporary, but it was enough. The giants responded with escalation rather than adaptation. Fire giants doubled their forges, binding ever more destructive runes into weapons that could shatter draconic bones with a single blow. Storm giants called upon greater elemental forces, tearing open the sky itself to punish entire flights at once. Stone giants shaped the land into traps, collapsing valleys and sealing dragons beneath living rock. Each response worked, briefly, but every escalation demanded more magic, more sacrifice, and more certainty that Anum's design would ultimately prevail. The giants could not imagine abandoning the ordning, even as its rigidity became increasingly costly. To do so would be to deny the god who had made them what they were. Here, the war revealed its deeper cruelty. The dragons were learning. The giants were obeying. Entire generations of giant kind were consumed in battles whose outcomes had already been anticipated by draconic minds centuries earlier. Victory for the giants required flawless execution. Victory for dragons required only a single fracture in coordination. Over time, those fractures multiplied. The land bore witness. Ruined giant cities sank into the earth, their stones cracked by repeated assault. Vast regions became uninhabitable, saturated with lingering magic that warped creatures and weather alike. Dragons claimed these scars as lairs, not out of comfort, but because no giant force could safely pursue them there. Midway through the war, a realization spread quietly among giant seers. The conflict was no longer restoring order. It was unraveling it. Yet even this understanding could not halt what had been set in motion. The giants were bound not only by hierarchy, but by belief. To retreat would be to admit that Anum's design was flawed. To compromise would be to elevate chaos alongside order. Neither choice was acceptable. The dragons sensed this desperation and pressed it. What followed was not a decisive battle, but a slow turning of fate. The war began to favor those who could bend, rather than those who stood unyielding. And Toril, battered and reshaped beyond recognition, moved closer to an outcome neither side had ever intended when the first blows were struck. The longer the war endured, the less it resembled a struggle for dominion, and the more it became a test of limits. Limits of power, belief, and endurance. What neither dragons nor giants fully understood at first was that the greatest damage was no longer being done to one another, but to the fabric of the world they fought to control. Magic, once a tool, had become an atmosphere. The continuous use of rune lore and draconic sorcery saturated entire regions. Spells no longer ended when their casters fell. Storms summoned by storm giants lingered for generations, trapped in cycles of thunder and ruin. Fires kindled by ancient reds burned beneath the earth long after the dragons that unleashed them had departed. The world remembered the war even when its participants moved on. This had consequences neither side could command. Creatures born in these scarred lands emerged twisted by residual power. Elemental boundaries weakened. The distinction between natural disaster and deliberate weapon blurred until it no longer mattered. Toril itself began to behave unpredictably, as if resisting the forces imposed upon it. For the giants, this was a profound theological crisis. The ordning assumed a stable world, one that could be shaped, ruled, and improved through proper hierarchy. As landscapes collapsed and magic slipped beyond control, storm giant visions grew erratic. Prophecies contradicted one another. Omens lost clarity. The future, once something to be read, became clouded and fractured. The giants did not interpret this as a warning to stop. They interpreted it as a call to intensify their efforts. If the world was breaking, then greater force was required to set it right. More powerful runes, larger weapons, deeper appeals to divine authority. Fire giants drove their forges beyond safe limits, sacrificing entire holds to empower singular weapons meant to slay even the eldest worms. Frost giants unleashed campaigns of annihilation across northern reaches, caring little for what remained afterward. Dragons observed this with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. They had anticipated giant rigidity. They had not anticipated the scale of destruction giants were willing to accept in the name of order. Even among dragons, whose pride often bordered on madness, there was an understanding that a ruined world offered little worth ruling. Yet retreat was impossible. Dragons who attempted to withdraw found their ancestral lairs destroyed in their absence. Giants who sought to preserve isolated regions were punished by their own kind for deviation. The war had become self-sustaining, driven by fear as much as ambition. At the heart of this phase lay a subtle but critical shift. Dragons began to fight not for victory, but for advantage in the aftermath. They claimed regions rendered inaccessible by lingering magic, knowing that giants could not safely occupy them. They hoarded knowledge of long-lasting spells, not to win battles, but to shape what the world would look like when the fighting eventually burned itself out. The giants, by contrast, still fought as if there would be a final reckoning, a moment where order would reassert itself completely. This difference in expectation mattered more than any single battle. As Taril's wounds deepened, the war crossed from devastation into transformation. The age of balanced powers was ending, though none yet knew what would replace it. What was certain was that the world emerging from this conflict would no longer belong fully to those who had begun it. By the later ages of the Dragon-Giant War, the struggle had lost any clear rhythm of advance or retreat. Instead, it unfolded in cycles of annihilation followed by uneasy pauses, as both sides required time simply to endure what they had unleashed. It was during one of these pauses that the foundations of Giantkind's downfall were quietly laid. The Ordning, once a source of unity, began to strain under prolonged catastrophe. Storm giants, burdened by failing prophecy and endless responsibility, grew increasingly isolated from the rest of their kind. Their visions no longer offered certainty, only fragments of possible futures, many of them bleak. Fire giants demanded greater autonomy to prosecute the war effectively, arguing that delay and ritual were costing them entire holds. Frost giants, hardened by centuries of brutal fighting, cared little for divine order and less for restraint. The hierarchy did not collapse. It calcified. Disputes that once would have been resolved through divine authority instead festered, unspoken but corrosive. Commands were obeyed, but without conviction. Campaigns proceeded, but without trust. Giantkind remained united in form, yet hollowed in spirit. Dragons felt this change almost immediately. They began to encounter giant forces that fought with discipline but lacked cohesion beyond immediate objectives. Reinforcements arrived too late. Retreats were misinterpreted as defiance. When storm giants were absent or slain, no clear authority replaced them. Dragons exploited these moments relentlessly, striking hard and withdrawing before a coordinated response could form. A critical realization spread among the eldest dragons. The giants could still win battles. They could no longer win the war. This understanding did not lead to mercy. It led to patience. Dragons shifted from constant engagement to selective devastation. Rather than contest every giant advance, they allowed certain regions to be overrun, only to erase them later through concentrated assault. Entire fire giant forges were annihilated after years of labor, their destruction timed to maximize exhaustion and despair rather than immediate tactical gain. The giants answered with increasingly desperate measures. Hill giants were driven into the forefront in unprecedented numbers, their lives spent to buy time for higher castes. Stone giants abandoned preservation and joined open warfare, sacrificing memory for survival. Storm giants called upon deeper forces of sky and sea, draining themselves physically and spiritually in the process. None of this restored balance. Instead, it accelerated collapse. The land reflected this internal decay. Giant roads fell into ruin, unused or destroyed. Once great citadels were abandoned when they could no longer be defended or supplied. Dragons claimed the ruins, not as symbols of triumph, but as markers of inevitability. In this phase of the war, the first whispers of defeat reached Giantkind. not as a spoken admission, but as a creeping awareness. The giants were no longer shaping the future. They were reacting to it, and Toril, reshaped by their struggle, began to pass beyond their ability to command, even if victory were somehow achieved. The turning of the war did not arrive as a single shattering moment. It arrived as erosion. Loss by loss, retreat by retreat, the giant empires began to fail in ways that could not be reversed by strength alone. What had once been a conflict of equals slowly became a struggle against inevitability. The storm giants were the first to feel it most clearly. Their visions, once the guiding force of giantkind, fractured beyond reliable interpretation. Where prophecy had once offered direction, it now presented contradictions, possible futures that diverged wildly, none of them decisive. Some storm giants withdrew from leadership entirely, unwilling to issue commands grounded in uncertainty. Others clung to their authority with increasing rigidity, mistaking resolve for clarity. This paralysis mattered. Without consistent foresight, giant campaigns lost their strategic edge. Dragons no longer needed to anticipate giant movements. They observed the confusion directly. Where once the giants had struck with terrifying coordination, now their responses lagged behind events already unfolding. Among the dragons, this phase marked the rise of draconic age dominance. Ancient and great worms, those who had survived the longest and learned the most, began to dominate the conflict. Younger dragons still fought, but increasingly as expendable forces or territorial guardians rather than decisive actors. The war became shaped by memory, by creatures who remembered earlier victories, earlier failures, and the patterns that linked them. These eldest dragons understood something the giants could not accept. The war would not end through annihilation. It would end through exhaustion and fragmentation. Rather than pressing for complete destruction, dragons focused on dismantling what remained of giant infrastructure. Trade routes vanished. Communication between distant holds became sporadic or impossible. Giantkind still possessed strength, but it could no longer concentrate it effectively. A decisive shift followed. Giants began to fight defensive wars rather than campaigns of control. Entire regions were abandoned, not because they were lost, but because they could no longer be sustained. Retreat was no longer strategic. It was necessary. Each withdrawal weakened the Ordning's authority, as survival replaced hierarchy as the primary concern. This was the moment when the giants ceased to be rulers of the world. They were still powerful, still feared, but they no longer shaped the fate of Toril on a global scale. Dragons felt no triumph in this realization. Victory brought with it an unexpected problem. With the giants withdrawing, the war's unifying purpose began to dissolve. Rivalries between dragons resurfaced. Ancient grudges, suppressed during the height of the conflict, re-emerged. The very independence that had allowed dragons to endure now prevented them from forming a lasting dominion over what they had won. The war was approaching its end, but not its resolution. Toril stood scarred and unstable, its ancient masters weakened, its future undefined. The collapse of giant supremacy did not usher in peace. It created a void, and the world had not yet finished paying the price for it. The collapse of giant dominance did not arrive with surrender or proclamation. It arrived through silence. One by one, the great works of giantkind ceased to matter. Roads no longer traveled, citadels no longer defended, and councils no longer convened with authority that reached beyond their own walls. What remained of the Ordning fractured along its own lines. Storm giants retreated into isolation, withdrawing to the far reaches of sea and sky. no longer capable of guiding a world that refused to yield to prophecy. Fire giants clung to conquest, but without the infrastructure to sustain it, their wars became localized and increasingly futile. Frost giants turned inward, abandoning grand ambition in favor of endless raiding. Stone giants vanished into the deep places of the world, preserving memory rather than power. Hill giants scattered, no longer a force, only a symptom of decline. This fragmentation was irreversible. The giants had not merely lost territory, they had lost coherence. The divine structure that had once unified them could not function without a world stable enough to support it. Anim's design remained, but the conditions that allowed it to rule Toril were gone. Dragons emerged into this new age cautiously. They had achieved what they sought, the end of giant supremacy. Yet the aftermath revealed the limits of their victory. The lands left behind were warped, unstable, and often hostile even to draconic rule. Many regions were saturated with lingering magic that resisted settlement or long-term control. Others had been reduced to wastelands where nothing of value remained. Ancient dragons claimed vast territories, but these claims were personal, not imperial. No draconic hierarchy arose to replace what had fallen. Each worm ruled its domain alone, answering to no greater authority. Where giants had once imposed order, dragons imposed presence. The world belonged to whoever could hold it, and even that hold was temporary. This absence of unity carried consequences. Without a shared purpose, dragons turned against one another as readily as they had once turned against giants. Territorial disputes reignited ancient rivalries. Alliances dissolved as soon as they ceased to be convenient. The skies grew dangerous not because of organized war, but because power existed without restraint. Toril entered a new phase of existence. The age of great empires was over, but peace did not follow. The world had been emptied of its first rulers, yet no true successor arose to claim their place. The dragon-giant war had ended in function, if not in memory. What followed was not harmony, but vacancy, a world waiting for something new to emerge from its ruins. With the Great War effectively spent, Toril entered a long, uncertain aftermath shaped not by triumph, but by consequence. The world no longer moved according to the designs of dragons or giants, yet it still bore the weight of their conflict in every broken range and unstable sky. The dragons, for all their power, discovered a truth they had long ignored. Dominance was not the same as stewardship. Ancient worms ruled vast territories, but their reigns were solitary and brittle. A dragon could scorch a mountain clean of rivals, yet could not restore the land it had rendered barren. Lairs carved into magically scarred regions offered safety, but little growth. Over time, many dragons withdrew into isolation, preferring hordes and memory over governance of a world that resisted control. The giants, meanwhile, did not disappear, but they ceased to shape history. Their remnants endured as scattered cultures rather than a unified force. Storm giants lingered as distant watchers, fire giants as stubborn warlords, frost giants as predators of the margins. Each remembered the war differently, yet all lived within its shadow. The age when giants decided the fate of Toril was over. In this vacuum, the balance of the world shifted. The lingering magic of the war altered climates, reshaped coastlines, and created regions of wild, unstable power. These changes were not guided by intention. They were consequences, unfolding slowly and without regard for those who came after. Toril became more dangerous, but also more open. no longer dominated entirely by immortal powers. It was in this altered world that something unprecedented became possible. Space emerged. Not empty land, but opportunity. Regions no longer claimed by overwhelming force. Skies no longer ruled by coordinated flights. Lands too fractured for giants and too costly for dragons to hold. Into these spaces, younger races would one day step, not as rulers by right, but as survivors of a world shaped by others. The Dragon-Giant War had not ended creation. It had cleared the stage. And though neither dragons nor giants intended it, their conflict had prepared Toril for an age they would no longer command. Long after the last great battles faded into memory, the true legacy of the Dragon-Giant War continued to unfold. The world did not heal so much as it settled, its wounds becoming permanent features rather than scars destined to fade. Mountains born of violence remained jagged and unstable. Seas altered by ancient magic followed unfamiliar currents. The shape of Toril itself had been rewritten. For dragons, this era revealed an uncomfortable truth. Their victory had secured freedom, not dominion. Without unity, without a shared vision beyond survival and possession, their power scattered across the world in isolated reigns. Each ancient worm became a fixed point, immovable, feared, and ultimately stagnant. Time passed around them, not through them. Their rule shaped places but not history. The giants faced a different reckoning. They endured as peoples, but not as a world-defining force. Anim's ordning still existed as divine law, yet it no longer governed reality in practice. Without empire, hierarchy lost its reach. Giantkind adapted to survival rather than rule, their ambitions shrinking to match a world that no longer supported grand design. This shift marked a profound transformation in Toril's balance. Power became fragmented. No single race or force could dominate the whole of the world again, not without cost beyond what even immortals were willing to pay. The devastation of the first apocalypse had taught a lesson written into the land itself. Unchecked supremacy invited ruin. It was during this long settling that the foundations of later ages quietly formed. Magic stabilized into patterns that mortals would one day learn to touch. Regions abandoned by ancient powers became habitable, if dangerous. The absence of overwhelming rulers created space for adaptability rather than raw might. Strength alone was no longer enough. The war had stripped Toril of its first masters, but it had also tempered the world. What remained was not peace but possibility, shaped by the memory of annihilation and constrained by the knowledge of what absolute power had once destroyed. In the deepest accounting of history, the Dragon-Giant War is remembered not for who survived it, but for what it ended forever. It was the last age in which Toril was ruled openly by primordial races who believed the world existed solely for their dominion. When that belief was shattered, it did not return. The war became the first apocalypse because it rewrote the rules of existence. Before it, power was absolute and unquestioned. After it, power carried consequence. Dragons learned that supremacy without unity led only to isolation. Giants learned that divine order could not command a world reduced to ruin. Both races endured, but neither would ever again shape the destiny of Toril alone. The world itself emerged as the final authority. Its broken lands, unstable magic, and reshaped skies imposed limits even on immortals. No god intervened to restore what was lost. No divine hand erased the damage. The silence that followed the war became its final judgment, a truth more binding than any decree. From this silence, later ages would rise. The time of dragons faded into memory. The age of giant empires collapsed into legend. In their absence, Toril became a world where survival favored adaptability over birthright, where history would be shaped not by eternal beings alone, but by those who learned to live within the ruins of ancient power. Thus ended the first apocalypse, not with the death of dragons or giants, but with the end of their certainty. The world moved on, scarred, changed, and finally free from the hands that had once nearly destroyed it.